as a young man, when I saw President Kenyatta and Emperor Haile Selassie being driven in open cars with people hailing them, both in Nairobi and here in Addis Ababa. We've seen that also in European capitals, but today leaders have become so antagonistic to their own population. Their own survival matters more than the survival of their population.
Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That is really good. All right, now I'm going to ask you the last question, because the interview actually is two sessions. We talk about the problem, then we talk about also the solution. All right, now, if I already hinted on this before, which is why we have very old people in the system, people who belong to the past. There are people who belong to the past, there are those who belong to this new generation. So why? Because Africa actually is the youngest continent in the world. This one will be demonstrated by many respects. By that, it should mean that Africa actually should be flying. Our leaders should understand how to use Facebook, how to use Twitter, because we are the generation of the social media, as it were. Just an example, you see, in Nigeria, before the event of the 20th of October, where they massacred a lot of innocent protesters in Lekki Toll Gate in Lagos, the Nigerian government still didn't realize the potency, the power of the social media, probably. Because up until that point, it was not an issue to regulate it as, like, it's not really a regulation, they want to restrict it. That is what they are proposing now, no? What I'm saying is that, like in Cameroon, we still have leaders who continuously remain in power, whereas there are a lot of young people who are able to power the economy with their intellectual. Because they are born in this age. They understand the workings of this age, how to negotiate contracts, how to talk with other diplomats around the world. Why do we still have these old people in politics? Why is it that they are just the ones that are favored? That is the question. I don't understand why.
There has been a problem that many African-born business even try to address. For example, the Mo Ibrahim Foundation has committed to provide $5 million for African leaders who leave the office peacefully and hand over power to whoever is the winner in a democratic system. But we don't have many, even in the Mo Ibrahim criteria and the reports that they publish. These people, African leaders are not only supported by their own ethnic groups and the few people that surround them who are beneficiaries of the system, but also they are protected by foreign powers. There are some African leaders who spend most of their time in France rather than in Africa. Heads of states who have really their livelihoods pegged in the European continent instead of Africa. As I said earlier, people like Mobutu Sese Seko, we don't know where their money is that has been looted from the DRC. We have many examples I can give you. The problem has been that these people have really captured the state to a point where they can suppress anybody, they can kill anybody, they can kill their institutions, they can reorient their institutions in ways that really promote their own personal agenda. And therefore, it's very, very difficult to do anything. And frankly, the international community can also do very little to transform this. What I would look is, like the anti-colonial movement that we had in Africa, really our forefathers have fought very hard to remove colonialism from our continent. Our fathers have also toiled so much to remove military dictatorships. And since 1991, since they didn't have the two Cold War camps to support them, they're now having elections every 4 years or 5 years to show at least there is a kind of a semblance of some kind of democracy. But the point is the African youth has to rise up and take these people into question. And they are doing that. Many young people are being killed in many parts of Africa. I can tell you in Ethiopia, a lot of young people have perished because of protest movements for better governance and also for equitable development. The point is the change can come only within Africa. They cannot come from the United Nations or even institutions like the African Union. I think We've given up on these big institutions. The kind of governance change that should come have to come from the grassroots, and we need grassroots leaders to bring this up. The problem is, however genuine our grassroots leaders are, when they go up the ladder, they become the same kind of leaders that have been there before them. So this is a problem of the human mental corruption that really leads people into a box where they should be the only privileged ones. And therefore, it's very important. It's not just a question of elections. It's not a question of creating political parties, but it's really a question of ensuring livelihood security for the African people. Frankly, some African people that have gone around the village are still look like in biblical standards. Even famines that come, for example, in Ethiopia and in other parts of Africa, in the Sahel belt, are called biblical famines. These are things you cannot imagine. In one of the organizations that I am a trustee for, where we've been assisting about 22 million refugees in Africa. And these are refugees that have run away for their life because of conflicts, because of these are state-sponsored conflicts that really undertake what you call ethnic cleansing. I've seen really what happened to Central African Republic, where state-sponsored murder of its own people have been undertaken. And therefore, it's very important that young Africans now articulate a way out of this. And some countries have done it. Some leaders have also transformed themselves and developed democratic processes that can benefit many of their citizens. But we have few examples of this. And therefore, what I look for is now a self-empowered generation, because when you talk about empowerment, I don't think anybody can empower anybody else. Empowerment is a self-process that happens within a human being. And of course, the organizational requisites that are important to transform the kind of visions of these young people have into a movement that can bring in most of the Africans behind them. This is like the decolonization of Africa. Few people started it, but the entire African people fought for it. They died for it. And this imperative that today that kind of struggle must continue in a peaceful way to be able to get rid of these people. People who have been in power there for 30 years. People who don't even have decent spaces in their own countries in Africa have built palaces in Europe and elsewhere. Their monies have been kept elsewhere. One example that you can see is the Francophone Africa, where they're trying to struggling to create their own currency. They're still using the CFA franc that is pegged to the Central Bank of Paris. And this is a shame in the 21st century when a nation cannot even manage its own exports, cannot even manage its own finances. And this problem is only a symptom of the wider political problems, development problems you have in the continent. So our leaders have not tried to opt out of this. There is still a discussion of whether the ECO should take place as the new currency of the Francophone states or whether a CFA franc should start. And I see, to my surprise, some defense for the existence of CFA franc and for continuation of CFA franc. At one time, one leader in West Africa was really blasting France for the continued dominance of African politics. But the point also, what we have to look into is, for example, two French presidents have said, without Africa, France would be a third world country. They have said it publicly. And this shows, that the problems you have within Africa don't stay within Africa, but they are generated from the international community and a club of people who are really trying to capture the state completely. And that's really what's happening. Some revolutionary process must take place. I'll tell you, in Ethiopia, it was the same process. Guerrillas came to power, and they came to capture the state again. In other countries where parties have won the presidency, they capture the state again. You know, when we have rules that are made in a country, we have the constitution, of course, which is purportedly written by the population at large. We have legislative rules that come out of the House of Representatives or Parliament, but we have also administrative rules that interpret the legal regimes that come from the legislature. And it is administrative rules where presidents have tremendous amount of space to shape the kind of legal regimes we have in any country. Because these are not accountable to the House of Representatives, these are not accountable to the people of Africa. This kind of regulations that come out of the Council of Ministers or the President's office is always the most difficult thing to look into. We've done a study of the transition to democracy in Africa starting in 1991 to 1996. And what started as a revolutionary movement to democratize the continent and to bring in new leadership has been going back. And I don't think anybody is looking at this except some foreign funded, USAID funded or American NGO funded process that we see in terms of reports like the Afrobarometer or other means. So it's very important for the African Union Commission to look into these kind of trends, to report to them to the summit of heads of state and governments. And therefore, at the end of the day, these people will be conscious of what's really going on in their own country. But if presidents are able to change their constitutions to be presidents for life, that's when the problem starts.
Thank you so much for that. All right, this part that we are treating now is a solution. We are basically giving you a recommendation to the problem we have discussed above. No? And it is obvious to those of you that have been listening to this point that the current crop of leaders that we have in Africa, except for very few, they are not really representing the interest of the African people. This one is very point clear because, for example, if for a European citizen, for any reason, is maltreated in any country in Africa, I repeat, in any country in Africa, they will be all up against such a country. They make sure it doesn't happen. But if an African citizen is maltreated anywhere in the world, no African leader, I repeat again, no African leader will come out to defend such an individual. This is also evidence is the exodus that is taking place now, where thousands and thousands of Africans, they are on their journey to die. The death trap between Africa to Europe. If you are a leader, if you are somebody who cares about your people, you should be crying. If you are an African leader and you care about your people, and you see what is happening to these young people who should be at home, working to contribute to the interests of their country, they are being loaded in chains, they are being sold like goose in Libya into slavery. And this is, after all, happening in 2020. They cannot say they didn't know. They cannot say they are not aware. This is the reality that we have on ground today in Africa, meaning that the current crop of leaders we have, they are not representing us. So now, for individuals who want to become leaders, maybe we can look at it generally this time, or we can look at it from a political point of view. I don't know, you choose. They have to develop certain kind of qualities, because leadership should not be the job of just anybody, because there are certain things that you just have to be. Anybody cannot just be a leader. So from your point of view, from your experience, what do you think are those kind of quality a person should possess to be a leader?
Leadership is it's a calling. Leaders are created in different circumstances. When you have problems and crisis, that's when leaders come out. And that's what we've seen with the decolonization of Africa. A few leaders came out, they voiced their concerns about colonial powers, the kind of suppression, looting, the kind of murder of the African young people. And these leaders proved themselves by liberating Africa out of the shackles of colonialism. Then, of course, what really happens in Africa is all our leaders, through at some point in time, even if they are elected new, have been serving in the boondocks of government from time to time. So for me, the kind of leaders we need in this continent are people who through their deeds, who through their words, who through their speech would shape the kind of morality that public administration would need. The kind of a public administration system that has been developed by Max Weber throughout history and that we teach in universities now are not compatible with the kind of leaders we have today in Africa. They always design their national budgets. And when you talk about, for example, women's empowerment, you have hundreds of workshops going on. On food security, you have hundreds of workshops going on. But the point is, leaders, if they're going to do anything about it, they have to put it in the national budget. And this is what's missing in the entire African continent. Even wealthy nations, such as Nigeria, South Africa, which has really a developed economy and is a member of the BRICS, but yet the level of poverty you have and the kind of disempowerment that really exists within the Black population in South Africa is frightening. And frankly, anybody can be sorry for this. So the idea of creating and generating leaders is a process where people prove themselves of what they can be to the community that's going to select them, elect them, or put them in power. The problem has been that in Africa, once they are in power, they don't want to leave that power base. And for this, they have a team to put them there, in the military, in the security apparatus, in the bureaucracy, in the regional and local leadership. Really, the biggest problem we have in this continent today is corruption, both political corruption and economic corruption. The kind of political corruption is fueled by the resources that this continent generates. And of course, there is a lot of money also flowing into the continent, especially now with the advent of China as a big provider for Africa. We don't really know where this continent is going on or going to. The Chinese government always profess that it is a South-South development, that its aim is, and therefore it wants to develop Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, South Asia, to a point where human beings can feel like human beings. But are African leaders taking the same steps? Like Zambia, for example, is defaulting on its debts. Uganda might be Angola might be the next one. While a lot of infrastructure and other developments are being made here with foreign support, our leaders are not at the center of the activity that's being undertaken. And therefore, they really have to come into that. The kind of leaders that you need to have are people who articulate the economic, political, social, and cultural agenda. The kind of leadership that you have should be people who really go to their own people and ask questions on whether their livelihoods are sustainable. That point is, we don't have it anymore. At one point, I used to see President Moi of Kenya to go to the marketplace and talk to the people and to make speeches there. But we have a different kind of African leaders now. So a new crop of African leaders is required to transform this. And a kind of flicker of hope that we had was in Ethiopia with Nobel laureate now, Prime Minister Abiy, who came to power to transform things from this ethnic dispensation into a kind of governance that would promote political, economic, and social agenda. But now we are at war between ourselves in this country. And therefore it's important now, how do we get leaders that can really peacefully transform countries without the kind of conflict, without shedding the blood of their own citizens into the 21st century? For that, I think we need to do a lot of research and we need to do a lot of more talking about this. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. We're almost finished now. All right, now on the part of the the African Union, what is the role of the African Union in providing, because Africans at the moment, as of course you have demonstrated also in your response to this interview, are in dire need of leadership. What we need is not that the continent is lack of manpower. It's not that it's lack of the natural resources. It just lack the adequate management. We lack leaders who are able to know the need of the people and able to provide this need. That should be the only reason why they are in position of leadership. Otherwise, they should not be there. If it is just for the purpose of stealing, then start a business for yourself to make money. Politics should not be to enrich yourself. It should be about service. Now, is there a role that the African Union can play in providing quality leadership in Africa? And what is this role?
The Constitutive Act of the African Union permits the African Union and the Commission, that's the central organ, to be able to develop modalities for the improvement of the continent. Not only for the unification of the continent into one piece, but also for the improvement of the livelihoods of its people, for bringing in peace and security. And I think there are very important credentials that have been put into the African Union's agenda.
Hey, I hope you're having a good value from this podcast. Now, in case you want to improve yourself, we do have an e-learning community where you can learn anything from learning how to use computer, build a website, or set up a home business for yourself. All these and many more are available by becoming a member of our e-learning community. And it costs you as little as 65 cents per day. Of course, this is something anybody can afford. How do you get started? It's simple. Just go to Google and type aclasses.org or write me a personal email at obehi@aclasses.org, and we will set you up for your self-improvement journey faster than you can imagine. I repeat, aclasses.org or obehi@aclasses.org. Now, let's return to the podcast.
The problem is, one, the mandate of the African Union is limited by what the leaders of Africa do in their summits. Number two, there is this thin sovereignty issue of each country where interfering in other countries' affairs becomes very difficult. Of course, the responsibility to protect of the United Nations Declaration removes that sovereignty to a certain degree, but you need the permission of the Security Council to do anything like that. But if you see in Africa, almost over 30 countries are still being led by the same political party that has been in power since independence, like Tanzania, Chama cha Mapinduzi. And therefore, it's ANC in South Africa is the same. PDP is going also in Nigeria to on that track. And therefore, it's very important that the kind of state capture we have in this continent must be limited. And the political space should be able to open up. Most of the time, it's finance that really matter in this kind of work. Even the democracy development projects in Africa are funded by Western NGOs. Any conference that takes place is funded by Western NGOs, when Africa really has the money to do this. Nigeria is a rich country, South Africa is a rich country. We don't call these countries poor countries simply because the World Bank says a poor country is a country where the residents, citizens live below $2 or $1.25. Rural communities who are not really into the money transaction business have fulfilled lives that they consider is a good life and livelihood. So the point is, Africa has resources that it needs to undertake this kind of consultations. But the problem with any foreign agenda is it always drives that agenda towards the people who are paying for the money. who are paying for the conference, for the workshops, for the consultations of whatever are taking place. I don't think Africa should take now money from Western donors to be able to lift itself. Of course, there are relations in trade and development. There are relations in terms of financial bailouts that are necessary, like the HIPIC initiative, for example, has been important in terms of getting Africa out of the quagmire it was. The kind of infrastructure development that's taking place now through Chinese funds is also very important. But to feed ourselves when we have huge land resources, when we have huge water resources, probably this is the last continent with this kind of resources. We cannot even feed our own people in Africa. And therefore, it's very important that our leaders look into this, and the African Union should make it an agenda, not just another declaration, but why can't we do this? Why are our people starving? Why are our people going through the Sahara Desert, crossing into Libya and trying to go into Europe? Or crossing the Red Sea, trying to go into Saudi Arabia or Israel? And this has become a phenomenal issue where the European Union now is paying African governments to be able to contain their populations in their own countries. This is a shame for any country that's participating in this work when it can deal with its citizens. If by the constitution, African leaders are elected by their own people, they have to serve their elected people. We see now populist movements in Europe where they are anti-immigrants, anti-Muslim religion, anti-Black people. And this is going to go on. Even the United States, President Trump had actually refused to enter several countries in Africa at one point in time to the United States. And therefore, it's very important that African leaders, they're going to die at one point in time, and all you're left with is their caskets. But they don't think like that. Mugabe is gone, but the country he left behind is in shambles. So African leaders must be made aware of this, and the African Union has the duty to be able to inform countries on this process. Otherwise, simply because the African Union leadership could be criticized by a certain country, if we're not going to talk honestly about developments in this continent, then it's going to be business as usual. It's going to be another summit, another meeting, and nothing is going to change. So my hope, as I said earlier, is that it's only African indigenous people who can transform this in terms of the kind of governments they deserve. Very often they say that people get the government they deserve because they're reluctant to change it. But Africans have to rise up to this. There might be some casualties in the process. Of course, leaders will not go away quietly, but they'll try to silence any opposition that comes in their paths. And therefore, it's important. We see that they're blocking social media in many countries in Africa. They're blocking opposition candidates. They're blocking young people from protesting. And therefore, now, when these young people don't have any choice, they will go out to the woods, they will carry their guns, which are very cheap now everywhere, and you can get them very easily if you really need them. That is creating more crisis on livelihoods in this continent. So we need to appeal internationally, especially with media houses who can really tell the African Union is not doing its job. Tell the African governments that the institution they created some 50 plus years ago is not functioning the way it should function. The Organization of African Unity had its job done. It was the liberation of the continent from colonialism. That is when we should have shut down the African Union. But we said the African Union can do more, but it's not doing more. It's not doing more because of its mandates. It's not doing more because of its limited capacity. It's not doing more because of its ideological clarity. And therefore, some prominent leaders should come out and look at this. The biggest issue last year, the last two years have been the study into the financing of the African Union itself. When Gaddafi could pay anything that the African Union needed at one point in time, I'm sure Nigeria can do that, South Africa can do that, Botswana can do that. Many countries in Africa can do this. But the problem is, do they trust the African Union to bring the kind of transformation we need in Africa? The second question is, do they want that kind of transformation of their own people and in the process lose their power? So it's very important that we have a very serious debate among universities in Africa, the academia, higher institutions of learning everywhere, and of course, within the political establishment of the continent. Grassroots movements have to spread, and civil society has to be free to be able to talk and to demand change. Very often, even the constitutions that we have in Africa, most of the African people don't even know them. Forget the issue of understanding the constitution. Forget the issue of looking into the kind of privilege and prerogatives they get from the constitution, and also the kind of responsibilities the constitution puts up on every citizen. So it's very important that this kind of civic education that would transform the African young people into politically active citizens is an important first step in this process.
Thank you so much, Professor Costantino. It has really been very, very educating. The last thing I'm going to ask you after this one is not going to be a question, just a kind of a conclusion you are going to make. But this one is very important because they have to do with Pan-Africanism. They have to do with the central idea that we have been discussing today, which is about responsibility towards the people. That leaders should be responsible towards the people. Now, the question is this one. Is it possible that we can travel through the principle of Pan-Africanism to arrive as quality leadership in Africa, so that the leaders that we are aspiring to have should be the one that pass through the process of that understand it basically? Because Kwame Nkrumah went to Ghana after he studied in US, haven't understood the concept that Marcus Garvey has been preaching to the African Americans, has been preaching to the African diaspora. He went to Ghana and he transformed his country. And of course, not only him, many other young Africans at the time, they did this one. That was a process, a very interesting one. Now, can we sort of, is it possible that the salvation of the African people can be through Pan-Africanism? How should it go?
You see, at one point we had African icons in Pan-Africanism. These icons like Emperor Haile Selassie, President Nkrumah, President Julius Nyerere, even Nasser in Egypt were prominent Pan-Africans, Pan-Arabists who wanted to undertake collective action in order to protect this continent from exploitation, in order to promote this continent into something that is acceptable at international standards. The problem we have now is, look at Cote d'Ivoire, for example. Frankly, Cote d'Ivoire was in crisis, a country that was built very slowly and elegantly to a point where the economy was functioning properly. And then the kind of conflict we had between the current president, who is looking for a third term, against the constitution of Cote d'Ivoire, and President Gbagbo, who was taken to the International Criminal Court, but now he's freed and I hear he's coming back. They killed Cote d'Ivoire, just two people competing. It's not the people of Cote d'Ivoire that were fighting, but once they identified their ethnic groups and they said some of the people are immigrants from other parts of Africa. Mind you, before the colonial administration came, we didn't have borders in this continent. People interacted, people lived together. People went to a place where they could make a living properly. Communities accepted them. Of course, they had tribal conflicts of to some degree, especially where you have resource scarcity. But today, the kind of leadership we have in the continent, I don't think they have even the slightest respect for the African Union that they presumably founded. The African Union, the new African Union, was founded in 1993 in Maputo. But this it's not sinking into their head that the African Union Commission can make a change. So the biggest change will come again from the African youth, from the African intellectuals, academia, from the African business people. We see African billionaires today for the first time in our history. We see these billionaires financing programs on CNN, for example, the African programs that we have, banks that are financing this. But you don't see these African wealthy people who've made their money in Africa financing democratic debate in this continent, financing accountability of states to their own people in this continent. They would have left a legacy where by financing conference, workshops, consultations, and people's movements in a peaceful way. We talk about some great Africans like President Mandela, for example, the person who's been a one-term president and then of course is revered by the South Africans. But you cannot find, in fact, most African leaders cannot even survive in their own countries after their term is over. And now that they don't have anywhere to go. As a criminal in this world today, the world is so much connected that no country will accept them. Therefore, they have to stay in power by hook or by crook, or eventually their demise would be they're either killed or they are going to serve time in prisons. So there must be an innovative way by these rich Africans today to create institutions within Africa that will promote human values, that will promote shared values among the African continent. That's the only way I know it's a long process, it's a very tedious process, but that's the only way we can bring Africa into the 21st century.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. I don't know how much I can thank you. I really appreciate the time that you have dedicated to respond to all these questions. I know that our audience that are watching you, they also appreciate it. All right, now this is how we usually, thank you, sir. This is how we usually end the interview. We end it on a positive note, a kind of a message from you to the audience. It can be maybe towards the youth, because the problem that we have discussed today has been about leadership deficiency actually in Africa. So how do we grow, how do we build better leadership in Africa? So to these people that have listened to you for this long period, what do you want to tell them? Maybe there might be youth who want to get inspiration on how to move beyond the obstacle, the quagmire that we have right now. So the message can be anything that you want to give them. I want to believe that you don't want to suggest to them, hey, go and take arms and start fighting. But we believe that they are the solution. The youth of Africa, be the youngest continent in the whole of the world, they are the hope. They are the only hope that we have. So what is your message, a very brief one to them, to conclude it?
Well, you see, leadership training is very key in our world. I remember in the late 70s, 80s, leadership books started coming out. And most of them, you can find them even in airport bookstores and everything. They talk about leadership excellence. And all this arena of what you call new public management that has been adopted in Western Europe and Northern America are things that come from the private sector, from the corporate management into the public sector. That's what we call new public management. And in fact, it has taken the world management schools by storm in terms of political science, public policy, and democracy studies. We don't have this kind of leadership training institutions in this continent. We don't train our leaders in this continent. Of course, basically, we don't even have civics classes. We don't even have classes where we talk about the history of this continent. And in some countries, like Ethiopia, they have even taken away the curriculum of history. We don't even know where our children will never know where they came from. Ethiopia has 3,000 years of recorded history. But the leadership didn't want them to learn this. They wanted to be the first people who created this country all over again. So in Africa, we need to have that kind of historical narratives properly set up. What Pan-Africanism is, what our forefathers have gone through in terms of slavery and colonialism, and what kind of leadership imperatives are important to transform this continent. So that kind of leadership should be in the curriculum of every high school and college for students graduating out of these colleges, universities, and high schools, so that they become personal leaders, they become motivators and incubators for other leaders to come up in the continent. Is when you have that kind of critical mass where this continent's democratic agenda or governance agenda could be transformed. The second thing is, with this leadership training, it's important that the political rules and political institutions in Africa should also be migrated into something more participatory. I wouldn't say democratic or republican in a sense, because that needs the kind of political maturity among the citizens to be able to understand this. With a large population of farming families we have, subsistence families for that matter, in some cases we have pastoralist communities who have no access to education, who have no access to any kind of health care, who have no access to running water, or who have no access even to the markets around them. So we need to look into this. I'm not proposing to transform pastoralist population lives, but we have to give them the option so that they can transform their own lives and their kids' lives. The kind of pastoralist population we have in Ethiopia, they live on vast amounts of resources, fertile land, rivers, and everything. But whenever the first rains miss, they're subject of food aid. And therefore, this must change. A country that's building a dam worth $5 billion, and for that matter, 20 dams and 74,000 kilometers of roads in the last 10 years, cannot even handle the food security issue of its own citizens. So the leadership doesn't want it. That's why we have to have leadership training for every student that comes out of school. Luckily, what will happen is, even if some of these people, by some mechanics, become leaders of this country, at least they'll remember the kind of education they had as a background. And of course, that good leadership means to produce more good leaders, not to be the only good leader around and protect yourself with yes people who only take orders from the leader. And it's very important that we put this in their minds when the young minds can really articulate this, because young minds can understand this and it will remain in their brains forever. But the kind of experience we have in Africa is our leaders are privileged, they loot money, they have privileged lives, their families live abroad, and they're very rich, and everybody wants to be like them. They don't want to be the kind of genuine leaders who can transform the continent and the people of Africa into a better being, and at the same time transform themselves also into heroes that history will remember them for. So these are important anecdotes that we have to look into. But the most important thing is the kind of management and leadership training and the training of Africans in their history, that we had a vibrant African continent, that is the birth of humanity. I mean, all things that you look into world history now, the first human beings were found in Africa. Now, when we look into 7,000 years, it's Egyptian history that we look into. It's Ethiopian history that we look into. It's the kingdom of Dahomey in West Africa that we look into. This is the Shaka Zulu in Southern Africa that we look into. But African young people are not educated in this manner. The genesis of African states, what slavery and colonialism have done to Africa, and how Africa is going to lead the 21st century. This is very important. With few attempts and transformation of our leaders and getting the young leaders who are trained in leadership techniques to be able to take positions will project us into the 21st century. I have very much high hopes in this. It's not a kind of a doomsday where nothing is going to change. Frankly, it's going to change very soon. But those institutions, continental institutions, regional economic communities that we have are not changing with the people of Africa. They need to change with the people of Africa. If we cannot transform them, we have to create other institutions that can transform the kind of leadership quality we have in African leaders, or we have to find some of these dead institutions and transform them into functional institutions. The other area is the promotion of education in this continent. With the development of digital devices in this continent, where everybody now has mobile phones in most countries, we're able to deliver information. And these are critical information in terms of telling them what their constitution is, what their responsibilities are, what their benefits are, and how governments can be accountable to the people. The other area is the media, which has been really lagging in this continent. Really, the media has become also another elite squadron within the leadership of Africa. We need to transform that media. We need to have independent media that's not paid up by government or by several rich people in Africa, but media that can really transform the consciousness of our people into the 21st century. Africans have their own history, they have their narratives, they have their songs that express their feelings with, but these have been suppressed completely for a long period of time. It is the European, the Western lifestyle that have been dictated on the African people. It's the kind of corruption that you see in developed nations that is now permeating the African continent. But they have nowhere to go now with their money, because the global consciousness in terms of the kind of global connectivity we have under globalization is inhibiting these people to stock their money somewhere in the West, in Western banks, in Swiss banks. So it's very important that these people become accountable. So besides the leadership training, we also have to have a major kinds of advocacy to look into how young people can bring government into accountability. Thank you.
All right, with that, I want to say a big thank you to Professor Costantino, and also to you, our viewer, for having accompanied us to the end of this podcast. It has been also a pleasure for me to share my opinion with you. So whenever you are listening to this podcast, whether you are listening in YouTube, in Google Podcast, in iTunes, or in Spotify, make sure you subscribe. So thank you for listening, and don't forget to leave your comment on this podcast. And remain obey Air14, and bye for now.